The art of this war is to find the strategy for winning in a new way, which there's no blueprint. Ukraine has to invent it.
For the first time, they're winning, or they might win. Why on earth change that around when it's going in your direction? I mean, Putin must be chuckling about all this.
It was right the moment when Ukrainians were a bit relaxing into good news. They were hit unexpectedly by a truck.
I wonder if there's a theme here. Whenever someone emerges who is potentially more popular than Zelensky himself, he has them chopped. Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators with me, Matt Frei.
And me, Mark Urban. And on the Fourcast Indicators, we look at the signals that analysts watch most closely for the telltale signs that suggest imminent and significant change may be coming.
This week we're focusing on Ukraine, where President Zelensky has faced protests after sacking his defense minister Mykhailo Fedorov over a spat with Kyiv's top general Oleksandr Syrsky. Now it looks like the Ukrainian president has backtracked, sacking and replacing Syrsky, while also offering Fedorov a way back in. But to what exactly, and what comes next? How will this be felt on the front line, where the war seems to be edging somewhat in Ukraine's favour? And what's happening in Moscow while all this is going on? Well, to help us unpack it all, we're joined by the head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, Orysia Lutsevych. Orysia, great to have you. Let's first of all lay out what's actually happened this week. Mark, a lot of bad domestic politics for Zelensky. How did this all start?
Well, it started with the easing out of the defense minister, Mykhailo Fedorov. He was a very popular figure. A lot of Ukrainians felt that he was turning the tables at last on Russia with the deep strike and widespread adoption of drones policies. And I think they also looked to him to try and save people literally on the front lines by adopting more radical methods, AI and all the rest of it. So there was a lot of public anger when he was displaced, apparently over this spat with General Syrsky, who wouldn't make the changes that Fedorov says he wanted. That's his version. Now, since then, of course, what we've learned is that after protests on the streets for 6 days, the general was displaced, General Syrsky, and replaced with a new commander-in-chief. And in a way, that's our first key indicator for this week, the arrival of General Drapatyi as the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces. And I think the key points here are that he's 17 years younger than Syrsky. He's from a completely different sort of background. Syrsky was born in Russia, went to the Moscow military academy, and in some ways I think he's never quite escaped the taint of being a kind of Soviet man in the eyes of many in the Ukrainian army. And that includes being prodigious in accepting casualties, for example, in the Battle of Bakhmut that raged for nearly a year. We're going back a couple of years. And on other fronts. And so that's always made him a quite unpopular figure in the military.
But his nickname was the Butcher, wasn't it? He was called the Butcher, which is not exactly
and
a
many
compliment.
other things, yes.
And many other things too. And Fedorov, the chap who was sacked, might now be reinstated, is 35 years old, so a completely different generation.
Yes, it's a generational
and apparently had a good relationship with Elon Musk, and actually persuaded Musk to switch off Starlink for the Russians, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
Let's bring in Orysia. And Orysia, I mean, Zelensky's actually weathered quite a few storms, hasn't he? There was the Corruption Commission. That was a massive cock-up for him, which he managed to deal with. There was the resignation of his chief of staff. And now this. How important is this one, in the kind of annals of Zelensky's domestic woes?
Yeah, there's that saying now in Ukraine that in July people have to go to the streets to course correct mistakes that Zelensky is making as he is increasingly isolated and maybe too overconfident, or wants to shy away from responsibility and let things spiral out of control. As I think to a degree this conflict between Syrsky and Fedorov that was always on the background, and he did not properly neither mitigate nor manage, flooded the streets with these protests. So Ukrainians are saying we want a strategy of war that is fit for the revolutionary and military affairs that Ukraine has ushered. We want to make sure that people's lives, soldiers' lives, human lives are protected, and that Ukraine uses asymmetric advantage to inflict defeat to Russia. And that also requires reform in the Ministry of Defense. So I think Zelensky has hurt people. And as the result of this fallout, the appointment of the new major general is seen as a good sign, but it's not complete. We right now have the acting Minister of Defense, who is a quite successful general in the special operation forces of the Ukrainian security services, Mr. Khmara, who was in charge of spiderweb operation. But he is not a civilian, and he's unlikely to have Ministry of Defense for too long. So it's incomplete. The puzzle has not been folded yet.
Orysia, let me jump in there, because what's also incomplete is that Fedorov remains irreconciled in a way, doesn't he? He's refused the kind of offer of being kicked upstairs by Zelensky to some other job with a nice salary and a big office. And he said no. And I noticed in the polling released today, he's polling higher figures than Zelensky. So where does Fedorov fit into this? And can he be accommodated? Or is he becoming a political threat to Zelensky himself?
Well, Fedorov is clearly an ambitious man who has quite strong track record of success. He spearheaded the whole drone industry. He's not going to settle for some role of an advisor because, as he has demonstrated, he has a much bigger talent that requires not just advisory, but a real responsibility to allocate resources. So as long as the street backs him, he will try to push to have a position. But I do not see Zelensky actually backtracking and reappointing him as a Minister of Defense. And it is unclear as of now what exactly he was offering him, this kind of technology tsar, similar to like in the West, this position of an overarching leader for something. But that doesn't include right to allocate budget. And it doesn't include right to reform how the army is also rewarding people, how the contracts are managed, and how the data is used for decisions.
Orysia, I wonder if there's a theme here that Zelensky, who of course is enormously popular abroad and has become a really sort of, totemic, iconic figure in this war, in a way that very few people would have expected, is a very jealous leader at home. I mean, there's also the case, of course, of the former head of the army, who's now the ambassador in London, who apparently was getting too popular for his own good and for Zelensky's comfort. Is that what's going on here? That whenever someone emerges who is, potentially more popular than Zelensky himself, he has them chopped?
Yeah, Ukraine cannot have elections right now as the war goes on because of martial law, but it's always on the background. As any politician, they want to be re-elected, they want to be reinstated, so they are modeling different scenarios. And of course, the Fedorov's popularity grew up from the time he was appointed in January to now almost 20% points. He is now, overtaking Zelensky, and that could be one of the reasons why he was removed. But I think fundamentally there was a bigger conflict, the clash, and vested interests that were against Fedorov within the Ministry of Defense, with this old guard, the large defense companies that were losing contracts with this new strategy that he was pushing that would require purchasing new capabilities. So I think it's both. I honestly do not think that election threats or the competition was the main reason why he was sacked.
In his conflict with Syrsky, one of the issues is that I think Fedorov and some of the other reformers want to reduce the number of military commands. It seems that Syrsky allowed, I think it's something near 150 brigades to be formed, plus these corps commands, the regional commands. It all felt a bit like jobs for his brother officers at good salaries, and Fedorov wanted to reduce those. So to what extent do issues of military reform and indeed corruption lie beneath that conflict between Syrsky and Fedorov?
Look, I mean, I think it is possibly more strong impetus, a driver of this conflict than political jealousies. I mean, Fedorov really wanted to complete the reform of the Ukrainian army and to promote and to strengthen responsibility of some of the corps and brigade commanders in what they procure through the digital system that he has set up for their missions. So that gives more, decentralized control over the ground operations, which I'm sure Syrsky didn't share. He wanted to remain very much centralized command and control system. But also how unmanned systems, robotics, the drones and electronic warfare is integrated within the ground force in a more sophisticated way. I think this is where also he felt Fedorov was too much interfering into the strategy of war, which is de facto and de jure the responsibility of commander-in-chief. So this never could have, ended up well. And the problem is why Zelensky decided to bet on Syrsky, in a way now looking a bit like a lame duck, having lost two, to a degree you can say competent man, because Syrsky in a way stabilized the front line, retake some territory, is also actually quite as successful in what he does on the ground.
And he was the hero of Kyiv, wasn't he? I mean, he defended Kyiv at the beginning of the war from the Russian invasion and was credited for that. I just wonder, I mean, there are two things in my mind that I find puzzling. One is, how is it possible that Zelensky, who seems to have a real antennae for politics, keeps getting it wrong on these key issues? And secondly, I guess, the most obvious question is, what exactly did Fedorov do that made him so popular, especially with young people? I mean, is it the drone program, the fact that he came from the digital world, or is it that actually what he really wants to do through his drones is to save, the lives of young Ukrainians, men and women?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I think he was very popular because he comes from a different generation. He's like this government official from the future, right? He's well versed in technology. He understands markets. He understands how startups work. He started the whole drone industry from the Ministry of Digital Transformation, not from the Ministry of Defense. And he wanted to kind of roll over this approach within the Ministry of Defense and has failed because Zelensky didn't back him politically and didn't want to get, to deal with difficult subjects, managing all this conflict. He's also, I would say, quite good communicator. People understand what he's trying to achieve. He's young. And also he built this whole ecosystem where private sector, state and companies could really work together. One of the important things he did throughout the procurement, he allowed some of the more transparent purchasing through the kind of digital Amazon of the best capabilities who are performing well. So I think interesting about him is that he is very much data driven, like this. Let's use data for best decisions. We can have all these indicators, but who is the client? And he couldn't find the client, neither in Syrsky nor probably in Zelensky, because he didn't want to get involved at this granular detail. So he seems modern, he is modern, and he has good track record. And people believe that this is the way to go forward because, like you said, it's an asymmetric war.
Orysia and Matt, actually. I mean, I wonder whether Fedorov's popularity comes down to something really basic in a sense, that Ukrainians for 4.5 years have been going to the shelters and suffering all the nervous stress of these hundreds of drones coming in week after week. And now they see Russians in the same picture and the skies over Moscow black with smoke from burning oil refineries. I mean, it must have changed the mood there politically and in terms of a belief that victory was possible.
Actually, just to answer that quickly, Porrick O'Brien, our correspondent who was there for the last 2 weeks, that's very much the vibe that he got.
Yes.
That in Kyiv, where, by the way, the attacks, of course, from the Russian side are worse than they have been ever since the beginning of the war. I mean, they're spending every night virtually in the shelter, and not just in Kyiv, but also in Odessa and in Dnipro and in all these other places. But they do feel, as you mentioned, because of those black skies around St. Petersburg and Moscow, that for the first time, they're winning, or they might win. And Crimea and the fuel shortages and all the stuff that we've talked about in recent weeks So again, I kind of wonder, given the fact that things are finally going in their direction, and by the way, the Americans are desperate to get hold of Ukrainian drone technology, and the Gulf states are buying this stuff, and Ukrainian drones are the flavor of the month. Why on earth change that around when it's going in your direction? I mean, Putin must be chuckling about all this.
Yeah, exactly. It was right the moment when Ukrainians were a bit relaxing into good news. They were hit unexpectedly by a truck. And the shock that this caused, of course, led people to the street because, of course, to be honest, this is the successes that we are seeing now in Crimea, around Moscow, is the cumulative effect of a very long aerial campaign that probably started 2 years ago by taking down systemically Russian air defenses, all these command and control points, Russian Black Sea Fleet. So it's not that Fedorov did some magic in 6 months, but I think they felt like he was the first defense minister who had a strategy of attrition and clearly saying what is the number of attrition of Russian soldiers that is necessary, what is the number of drone production that is necessary. And I said it was all clear and believable. It was credible. And it was building on Ukraine's advantage that was proven. And suddenly to destroy all of this in the middle of success, exactly what angered so many people and brought them again to the streets.
I think Fedorov, in a sense, I mean, to borrow a bit of Napoleon speak, he referred to one of his marshals as the darling child of victory. And I guess that's what Fedorov benefited from. And there is a kind of element of tragedy here, isn't there, in that Syrsky, who had turned the Russians back from the gates of Kyiv, and I would argue led the one really successful Ukrainian offensive in terms of regaining land in
September,
in the Kyiv district. Several months into the war in 2022, was of course the flavor of the month back then, but now the fortunes of war have made him the pariah.
I think the difficulty is how do you combine this very long land front line with Russians pushing nonstop. When you look at the statistics, every night there are 200 assaults across this long front line on Ukrainian positions, and Syrsky in need of manpower, in need of replenishing forces, in need of artillery, in need of things that perhaps one of the reasons of the conflict, the Ministry of Defense wasn't procuring for them quickly enough, focusing, let's say, too much on new capabilities. So we will learn more over time with all of this. But I think the art of this war is to find the strategy for winning this war in a new way, which there's no blueprint. Ukraine has to invent it in order to win.
But I guess you could also say that even though this is a damaging episode for Zelensky, the fact that he's bowed to mass demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations on the streets of Kyiv and other cities, is another example that democracy is working in Ukraine. I mean, this wouldn't be happening in Russia. There wouldn't be demonstrations against a move like this in Russia. They wouldn't be allowed. But I do wonder, Orysia, how long he can hold out, Zelensky can hold out without going to the country and having more elections. This, of course, was always one of the demands, of the anti-Zelensky crowd, obviously in Russia, but also even in Washington. How long can he continue without going to the country, do you think?
He can continue as long as the active phase of war lasts. I do not think Ukrainians see the problem in not having elections. I think we forgot to mention that there's also a new prime minister in Ukraine, which is a very capable man from the energy industry. So there's a wider reshuffle happening. There's some new energy in Ukrainian government. But Ukrainians are not pushing for elections. It's about principles and institutions and about strategy, not so much about ousting Zelensky and finding somebody else to lead the country at this point in time.
Orysia, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I mean, that was fascinating, Mark. I was quite taken by the fact that she was so adamant that there was no demand for new elections in Ukraine, which, of course, would be music to kind of Putin's ears. But then again, Zelensky is he does seem to be very nervous about people, stepping into his limelight and outshining him. And Fedorov, when you watch him, I mean, he looks like a rock star. You can imagine him at, in a heavy metal band at Glastonbury, very, very charismatic. I don't know if his English is any good. Not that it matters particularly, but I imagine it might be. And if he gets on well with Elon Musk, managed to persuade him to turn off Starlink for the Russians, well, that's a massive deal. So we haven't seen the end of him yet, whatever job he ends up getting in the Zelensky cabinet.
No, and I mean, Zelensky's ability to sidestep the electoral question, which at times in the Ukrainian opposition has been quite a clamour, is an extraordinary part of his kind of political skill and his Teflon qualities as a leader. I mean, we all know he's been a remarkable war leader. Fewer people say, hang on a minute, why did you not mobilize Ukrainian forces shortly before the Russian full-scale invasion? And then you wouldn't have lost 25% of your country. He failed to mobilize despite those very explicit warnings that were given to him by Joe Biden and the Brits and everyone else. And yet, people will remember he said, no, send me ammo, not a ride. He was such a charismatic war leader. And we've seen over the years that have followed that when things stagnate, like the Battle of Bakhmut, or people become unhappy with the level of casualties, he knows how to deflect the responsibility. So you mentioned when we were talking to Orysia, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the then commander-in-chief for the first couple of years of the war, who was posted off to London because he argued with Zelenskyy about the way the army was finding its manpower and the need to find more soldiers. And now we see Syrsky, formerly the darling of victory, but now sacrificed. And it is fascinating looking at the polling today. I saw that Fedorov was described as the second most popular politician and Zelenskyy the third. I thought, hang on a minute, who's the first? And it was Zelenskyy by a big margin.
Zelenskyy still.
Yeah, by a big margin, sort of 20% ahead of Fedorov in terms of approval ratings. Yeah. So it is fascinating the way Zelenskyy holds it all together. I mean, it's part of his extraordinary political skill. But yeah, I mean, of course, there is opposition in Ukraine and plenty of people who draw attention to these things.
We should try and get Zelenskyy on the podcast, actually, because, there he is in the embassy in London. He's barely given any interviews at all, and his English is actually rather good. And I remember when I interviewed Zelenskyy in his bunker, when was it, January 2024, I think, quite a long time ago, he gave an interview that was very cleverly aimed at two audiences. There was the English audience, the global audience, and he spoke in English. And the first thing he said to me was, nobody likes a loser. And boy, was that right, especially in terms of interpreting what Trump might do. But then when it came to the question of manpower, which was then the hottest political issue domestically in Ukraine, he turned to Ukrainian. And he was addressing the very issue that then finally led to his spat with the guy who's now ambassador in London. So, I mean, I think Zelenskyy has, he's finely tuned when it comes to the various challenges, and why wouldn't he be? But at the same time, how often have we, has the global audience adored a leader who was then domestically very unpopular? The best example, especially when the comparison comes up, is, Zelenskyy is today's Churchill. Well, guess what? As we all know, Churchill won the war, but lost the election.
And got voted out straight away. And he retains this excellent ability to monitor popular discontent. I think he's been helped in that by this guy, Kirill Budanov, the former head of military intelligence, who now runs the presidential office. And he posted on social media a couple of days ago, please be calm to the demonstrators. We have heard you. And in that sense, people like Budanov help Zelenskyy to stay on the right track and not to become too distant from public opinion, which in this situation where we're more than 2 years overdue an election, it's a very important quality.
So summing up what we just heard from Orysia and what you think, do you think this domestic political nightmare for him will have an impact on the way the war's been going in their direction or not?
That is a fascinating question. And if we think that Fedorov, as the tech guy, was really driving not just the drone technology, which, as Orysia said very rightly, the seeds were sown years ago of being able to produce such large numbers of long-range drones to hit Moscow and all the rest. But he was also right there, as you mentioned, getting Starlink switched off for the Russians, building AI into some of the command systems that the Ukrainian military uses. A lot of efforts that were actually, coming back to this issue of manpower, designed to allow them to hold the front with fewer soldiers. In other words, putting fewer lives at risk. So he had a lot of things going for him. And the question now will be, I mean, we don't know yet whether he is completely out or whether Zelenskyy will find a satisfactory way to get him back into a job. But I mean, if he ends up going into political exile as Zelenskyy has, I think that could be quite harmful to the Ukrainian war effort.
Ukraine, in its years of need and existential fight, has reinvented warfare for the modern era in a way that has just left everyone else completely impressed. And you kind of get back to that old question, should Ukraine be allowed into NATO? I think the question should be, why on earth wouldn't you have Ukraine in NATO? They're the most viable, successful fighting force amongst all of the NATO members at the moment.
Yep, no doubt about that, Matt. I think the other thing that we've learned, it's a less explicit theme, I think, in our discourse, but I think it's quite an important one, which is the ruthlessness required to win in war.
Yeah.
We still believe, because of, I think, the experience of the 90s, the kind of advances in international humanitarian law, that kind of thing, that you can do all the nice things, tick all the boxes that human rights lawyers and others want you to. Now, what happens with Ukraine? Well, firstly, they bin the Ottawa Convention on landmines. They need landmines. They take other steps using cluster munitions, things that we would regard in Western armed forces after a long period of peace as being pretty out there in terms of the types of weapons used. And now, of course, they're hitting targets in Moscow, which I'm sure their lawyers would describe as contributing to the Russian war effort, like these warehouses belonging to this big e-commerce business. And they're saying, oh, well, drone components come in through there. Yeah, I'm sure they do. But this is effectively like bombing Amazon. It is bombing key aspects of the Russian economy as well, something which, I would say our senior military leadership, after so many years of peace and the kind of restrictions that they've been under humanitarian law, they'd be very reluctant to do that.
Can we talk about Russia for a bit, Mark? Because, Putin's had a pretty rough time with these black skies over St. Petersburg and Moscow. And let's not forget that every time they, fire long-range drones into Russian territory, the Russians fired, back twice or three times as much on a nightly basis into kind of mostly civilian targets in Ukraine itself, with some pretty heavy casualties.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Russian strategy of attacking the Ukrainian power grid, once again, you can make all the dual-use arguments. Sure, the Ukrainian military needs power, but of course, from the outset, it was there to try and make life miserable for the civilian population of Ukraine. And I guess that's been the name of the game for Russia from the start. But I do think, when we had Nina Khrushcheva on the program a few weeks ago, the position Putin is in now, I think, could well dictate that he escalates because the harm, I think, to his reputation, I think the key things, obviously, seeing the sanctuaries, as were Moscow and St. Petersburg, being violated so often now, plus the enormous pressure on Crimea, the great trophy of his policy against Ukraine from 2014, does put Putin in a very difficult position. And whether he chooses, as some people would hope, to accept a ceasefire or whatever, try and de-escalate, or whether he chooses, as Nina Khrushcheva was telling us, to go the other way, that's the big question.
The thing I can't get out of my head, and I remember doing a whole piece about it at the beginning of the war, just before the war, the big war started in 2022, was the combination in Vladimir Putin's existence of some very serious chronic social distancing, the guy more or less living by himself with a tiny coterie of trusted advisors, being a born-again Orthodox Christian, so his relationship with God, and this idea that he was put on earth to right the wrongs against Mother Russia and that he was a man of destiny chosen by, his deity. All those things put together, plus the fact that he's put all his eggs into this particular basket, makes me worried, frankly, that at the end of the day, when his back is up against the wall, that he won't try and do something that people around him might describe as suicidal or stupid. Now, and do they then have the cojones or the will to stop him, and get rid of him and put someone else in his place?
The other escalatory option, which we haven't talked about today, but we have in other episodes, and of course you hear a lot from the Poles, the Baltic republics, who are, of course, neighbours of Russia and very worried that Putin's other option might be some large-scale provocation against a NATO member that would suddenly switch the whole attention of the crisis to the Western alliance, and was it prepared to back up a nation that was facing some kind, not a full-scale invasion, but some kind of Russian aggression. I guess that's another big question that we're going to have to see how it unfolds over the coming weeks and months. But it's definitely another possibility that people are looking at very actively.
And then, of course, there was that little incident yesterday where there were Russian live fire exercises 45 miles south of Plymouth in the Channel on the day that Andy Burnham became our new Prime Minister. I mean, I have no idea whether this is, Russia's gunship diplomacy or whatever you want to call it. They've obviously denied it had anything to do with Andy Burnham. But, they're not averse to sending signals in a kinetic way, are they?
Absolutely not. And very close, in fact, their gunnery drills to a couple of ex-Royal Navy minesweepers crewed by Ukrainian sailors that are being trained in the Channel right now. So they may also have been signalling in that regard too. I think before we go though, Matt, we should just talk about one other thing, which is what's been going on in the Gulf, particularly with Saudi Arabia, and a big fat indicator. Now, I think I'll ask the question rhetorically, but are we actually now seeing the beginning of a nuclear breakout? Both because of recent intelligence we hear about this deep underground facility near Natanz, the so-called Pickaxe Mountain, the claims being made in the last 48 hours that the Iranians had moved uranium centrifuges into those very deep shelters that can't be hit by any conventional munitions, coupled with this announcement that the Saudis were going to get a nuclear deal from the Americans. Now, details are still pretty sketchy, but the idea is that America is dropping its objections to the Saudis developing the nuclear power sector, which may possibly include uranium enrichment.
Because I think, a nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia has been discussed for years. I think the Biden administration looked at it. Although enrichment was never part of the deal, it was going to be a civilian nuclear power for civilian use. So imagine that, the Sunni superpower in the region, Saudi Arabia, gets the green light from Donald Trump to not only have nuclear power with the Americans together, they're going to make money out of it, but also is allowed to enrich uranium, which is the very point over which the Americans went to war against Iran. I mean, this is not just is it bonkers in terms of hypocrisy, the timing of it couldn't be worse because it undermines the smallest bit of moral high ground that America might still possess when it comes to containing Iran's nuclear ambitions. But also, crucially, Mark, this was held out as a carrot to the Saudis should they eventually come to the altar and have proper relations with recognition of Israel and relations with Israel. And that was always part of the deal. You recognize Israel, and we will allow you to develop a nuclear program because, of course, you have to protect yourself against the Iranians, and they have plenty of reason to do so, especially now that Saudi Arabia is once again targeted by the Iranians as the ceasefire has collapsed. But they basically jumped the gun on this one. Now, there are other reasons as well, of course. We should mention the Palestinians, but this was a crucial part of that dynamic, and it's gone.
I think it speaks to a change in the power dynamic between Mohammed bin Salman and President Trump. You're right. It had been held out for years as the carrot. And the fact that it's been given away now, I think, hints at the dependence that Trump has on the Saudis in order to keep operations in and around the Gulf going. The Prince Sultan Air Base, various other places. And of course, Saudi Arabia is so huge that the overflight rights are critically important. Going back a couple of months when the Americans initially declared this Operation Freedom, when they said they were going to get the tankers out, and then 36 hours later they pulled the plug on it, that was because the Saudis had stopped them flying. So we've seen how critical Saudi Arabia's cooperation is to carrying on this US operation. And it looks like MBS has leveraged that to get the nuclear deal nice and early.
Just quickly before we go, I mean, the Strait of Hormuz, which he spent more time talking about than any other waterway in the world ever, has now been joined by the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, which is the one that, of course, the Saudis have been using to get their oil out. The Houthis getting involved. I don't know how much time we've got to talk about that, but I think we should just mention that very briefly, because in the escalation of the war, the ceasefire, I think, is gone, isn't it? I mean, it's kaput. But the fact that Bab el-Mandeb has now been included means that the Saudis are basically have both the straits on which they rely potentially closed off, and that is really bad news.
Yep. Bad news for the Far East, certainly. I mean, we know that several tankers turned around in the Red Sea on their way south towards that other strait, having had the oil piped over the Trans-Arabian pipeline from the other coast to avoid Strait of Hormuz. Now, I think the key questions here will be, is the Houthi blockade effective? We don't know. It's been threatened many times during the past month, since the 28th of February. And to what extent is the Hormuz blockade still effective? Is it perhaps that the Iranians sense there's a bit more leakage going on through Hormuz that causes them to try and apply more pressure on the world economy through their Houthi allies? Lots of questions that we're going to have to discuss at greater length in a future episode.
And to what extent are ship owners and insurers worried about this? Or is this now the new normal? I'm not sure, because the price of oil, last time I checked, which is this morning, has now gone up to $95 a barrel. That's about $25 higher than it was 10 days ago. So that's not good either, is it, for anyone? But let's leave it there, because there's always next week. Mark, it's been a joy. Bye-bye.